Most organizations treat Microsoft 365 governance as a project phase or something they can finally address after the go-live chaos settles down in Q3. They are wrong. 73% of organizations in regulated industries have recently paused their Copilot rollouts, but this didn't happen because the technology failed to work. Copilot stalls because it reveals what was already broken by surfacing the architectural entropy you have been inheriting since the first week your tenant existed. The uncomfortable truth is that governance was not actually delayed in those organizations, it was omitted entirely. Everything that followed, from the massive licensing waste to the shadow IT ecosystems growing parallel to your official tenant, was an inevitable consequence of that omission. This was not a mistake that better planning could have fixed. It was the only possible outcome for the system you built. I spend my time explaining why these systems fail rather than offering best practices or optimization frameworks that ignore the underlying reality. The only way to understand what is actually happening inside your Microsoft 365 tenant is to stop thinking of it as a platform. In reality, it is a distributed decision engine that you never bothered to architect. This episode is not a tutorial, it is an autopsy. The adoption first delusion. Let me start with the belief that matters most to leadership, which is the idea that adoption velocity serves as a valid success metric. During the first month of any Microsoft 365 deployment, leadership makes a choice that feels like a natural path, even though it is never framed as a conscious decision. You want people using Teams and collaborating to show momentum, so you prioritize speed above every other architectural consideration. Go live happens, users are provisioned, and licenses are assigned, while adoption curves continue to climb. This is exactly what success looks like to a board of directors, and for the first 18 months, it feels like you made the right call. The system appears to work, but here is the structural reality that nobody wants to hear during that first month of excitement. You have chosen to build a house on unstable ground while promising yourself that you will check the foundation later, but that day never actually comes. The foundational mistake is believing you face a choice between going fast or being secure. Organizations almost always pick speed because they assume governance is something you can simply layer in after the executive sponsors are satisfied. This feels reasonable to a manager, but this is exactly where the architecture fails. Without a governance layer, the system defaults to maximum permissiveness, which means every new team is public and every file shared is open to everyone. These are not configuration errors, they are the system doing exactly what you told it to do by leaving the gates open. Once 18 months pass, you find yourself with 12,000 teams and no idea which ones are still active or who owns them. 38% of those environments are now orphaned, meaning the project's ended but the data continues to accumulate in the dark. You likely have 17% of your sensitive files accessible to external users, but you don't know it yet because the system hasn't had a reason to expose the debt. Then Copilot enters the picture. What governance actually is, not what you think. You need to understand a fundamental truth about how these systems actually function. Governance is not a compliance layer, and it certainly isn't a checkbox you tick during an audit. If you treat it as something to be added after the foundation is already built, you have already failed. In reality, governance is the authorization compiler for your entire environment. It acts as the distributed decision engine across Microsoft 365, processing every access request and every sharing event. Every single data movement flows through policy rather than around it, which means the moment you omit governance, you effectively remove that compiler. The system will still make decisions about who sees what, but it will make them without any architectural constraints. The gap between policy and enforcement is where most organizations lose their minds. While 90% of companies have a policy, maybe 10% actually have enforcement to back it up. A policy might state that sensitive files should be labeled and restricted, but that is just a collection of words in a document. Enforcement is architecture, where the system actively prevents unlabeled files from being shared and automatically applies the correct labels based on the content it sees. These two concepts are not the same, and confusing them is a recipe for architectural erosion. Governance functions through three interlocking pillars: identity, data lineage, and policy enforcement. If you remove even one of these pillars, your decision engine shifts from being deterministic to being probabilistic. At that point, you are no longer actually controlling access to your data. You are simply hoping the system works out in your favor. That distinction matters because of what happens when you try to bolt governance on later. When you finally decide to address these issues in month 18 after adoption has stabilized, you aren't just adding a new feature. You are attempting to rebuild the entire decision engine while the machine is still running at full speed. Every data relationship has already been formed, and every permission has already been granted to users who have grown used to a permissive environment. Now you have to find a way to pull those permissions apart without breaking the workflows your company relies on. That is the exact moment your project stalls. Most organizations understand this intellectually, yet they still choose to prioritize speed over structural integrity. The cost of this belief compounds every single month, starting as a minor inconvenience and growing into a massive liability. By month 24, when a Copilot pilot finally exposes the scale of your oversharing, the cleanup cost for a 1,000-user organization can approach $500,000. The real question isn't whether governance matters to your bottom line. The question is whether you choose to architect it in from the start or try to excavate it out of the rubble later. Consider the 73% of regulated organizations that recently paused their Copilot rollouts. They didn't stop because the technology failed, but because they chose the path of excavation. Those companies are now 9 months into a remediation project that was originally supposed to be a simple productivity tool rollout. They are paying the price for treating the authorization compiler as an optional add-on. The event, when Entropy becomes visible. Week 6 of your Copilot pilot arrives, and for the first month and a half, the atmosphere is purely celebratory. Users are genuinely excited because the AI is actually working, and every metric suggests that productivity is finally moving in the right direction. Then week 8 happens. The shift starts when someone runs a routine Copilot query and the engine returns a concise summary of a confidential executive email. This didn't happen because the email was intentionally marked for public consumption, but rather because Copilot simply inherited the user's existing permissions. That specific user had access to sensitive files they never actually needed, and that happened because governance was treated as an optional add-on rather than a foundational requirement. In another department, Copilot might surface a detailed financial forecast during a casual chat. Nobody shared that document on purpose, but 15% of your business-critical files are already overshared to broad groups where that user happens to sit. The system isn't broken, it is working exactly as it was designed to work. The uncomfortable truth is that your design was actually just entropy. This is the trigger event that changes the project's trajectory. This is week 8 or 9 when your security team starts getting nervous, followed by week 10 when the legal team demands a seat at the table. By week 12, the entire rollout usually pauses indefinitely. The project didn't stall because Copilot failed to deliver on its promise, but because the AI finally revealed exactly what was already broken in your environment. Exposure rates are rarely a matter of guesswork. On average, 15% of business-critical files are overshared internally, while 17% are exposed to external parties who should never have seen them. Over 3% of all sensitive data is typically shared organization-wide without a single restriction. These numbers aren't just pessimistic estimates, they are the standard measurements pulled from remediation audits when organizations finally decide to look at the damage. The shadow IT ecosystem only makes this problem more difficult to manage. Most organizations are currently running about 975 unknown cloud services, which is roughly 8 times more than the IT department thinks exists. These unauthorized services are where employees send the data they don't think M365 can handle, which means your governance gaps have already pushed sensitive information outside of your controlled tenant. In this environment, sensitivity labels start to feel like a ghost story. Files without any classification multiply across your digital landscape, and Copilot outputs quickly lose their original source classifications as they are generated. The intelligence debt grows with every new interaction. Every AI-generated summary remains unlabeled, and every derivative document becomes a brand new governance problem for you to solve later. This is the exact moment the system decides your fate. It doesn't happen through malice or a technical error, but through the cold logic of its own design. You designed entropy by omitting governance from the start, and the system is now simply revealing the consequences of that choice. 73% of regulated organizations will hit the brakes at this stage. Once you have seen exactly what is exposed to the wrong people, you cannot unsee the liability. The compliance risk is now visible, the breach surface has been quantified, and the only remaining option is a long, painful period of remediation. The other 27% of organizations never have to deal with this crisis. They avoided the week 12 collapse because they chose to build the authorization compiler before they ever turned the AI on. What governance actually is, not what you think. To fix this, you have to understand something fundamental about the nature of the platform. Governance is not a compliance layer or a simple checkbox on a project plan. It is not something you can successfully bolt onto the foundation after the building is already finished. In architectural terms, governance is the authorization compiler. It functions as the distributed decision engine across the entire Microsoft 365 stack. Every access decision, every sharing event, and every movement of data flows through policy instead of around it. The moment you choose to omit governance, you are choosing to omit that compiler. The system will still make decisions, but it will make them without any meaningful constraints. When those constraints are missing, the system defaults to a state of maximum permissiveness. This is not a bug or a flaw in the software, but the system working exactly as it was engineered to behave. A new team defaults to public, a shared file defaults to everyone, and a newly added guest defaults to broad access. These aren't mistakes made by the software. They are the inevitable behaviors of an uncompiled authorization system. The gap between policy and enforcement is where most organizations lose their way. While 90% of companies have a policy, maybe 10% actually have the architecture to enforce it. Policy is just a statement of intent. You write down that sensitive files should be labeled and restricted, you publish the document, and you tell your employees to follow the rules. Enforcement is something entirely different. It is the architectural reality where the system prevents unlabeled sensitive files from being shared in the first place. The system automatically applies the correct label based on the content it sees, and it blocks any action that violates the established rules. Policy is just a document, but enforcement is a live decision engine. True governance relies on three interlocking pillars: identity, data lineage, and policy enforcement. If you remove even one of these pillars, your entire decision engine shifts from a deterministic model to a probabilistic one. Identity without data lineage means you have no idea what data a specific user can actually reach. Data lineage without enforcement means you can watch data flow to the wrong place, but are powerless to stop it. Enforcement without identity gives you rules, but no way to identify who actually triggered the breach. You need all three working in unison to form a compiler. When they are kept separate, they are just fragments of a system that isn't actually governing anything at all. When you try to bolt governance on 18 months after adoption has stabilized, you aren't just adding a new feature. You are attempting to rebuild the entire decision engine while it is still running at full speed. Every data relationship has already been formed, every permission has been granted, and every user has already adapted to a world where everything is open. The culture has normalized wide open sharing because nobody ever bothered to set up the barriers to prevent it. Now you are stuck trying to pull that mess apart without breaking the business. You find yourself applying labels retroactively to 12,000 files and restricting access to sites that users have considered open by design for over a year. You start asking questions about sharing patterns that happened 6 months ago, but nobody remembers why a specific file was shared with a specific group. No one documented the intent because the system was simply defaulting to its most permissive state. That is the point where remediation turns into an excavation project. You aren't optimizing the system anymore. You are desperately trying to reverse it. The governance-first approach follows a completely different logic. You establish the compiler before users have a chance to form bad habits or let data relationships calcify. Before the culture begins to expect maximum openness, you set the rules. You decide that all teams are private by default, all sharing requires a clear statement of intent, and all sensitive data must be classified. You enforce these policies at the moment of creation rather than during a cleanup phase. Users will adapt to constraints quickly if they encounter them on the very first day. They will only adapt to them bitterly if you try to introduce them on day 500. The architectural reality is that the 27% of organizations who don't stall during their Copilot deployment succeeded because they built the authorization compiler first. They didn't view Microsoft 365 as a collaboration platform that needed governance later. They designed governance as the platform itself, and they let everything else flow through it. That is the real distinction between simply managing Microsoft 365 and actually compiling it. One approach treats governance as a temporary phase, while the other treats it as the operating system. The event, when entropy becomes visible. Week 6 of your Copilot pilot arrives, and on the surface everything looks like a success story. During those first 5 weeks, the energy was high because users were excited, the AI was actually working, and your productivity metrics were finally trending up. Then week 8 happens, and the architectural reality you ignored starts to push back. The crisis usually starts when someone runs a routine Copilot query, and the engine returns a detailed summary of a confidential email. This didn't happen because the email was intentionally marked for public consumption, but because Copilot simply inherited the user's existing permissions. That specific user had access to files they never actually needed for their job, and that happened because governance was treated as an optional add-on rather than a core requirement. In another office, Copilot might surface a sensitive financial forecast during a casual chat. Nobody shared that document on purpose, but 15% of your business-critical files are already overshared to broad groups where that user happens to sit. The system isn't broken. In fact, it is working exactly as it was designed to work. The problem is that your design was based on entropy. This is the trigger event that shifts the mood of the entire project. This is week 8 or 9 when your security team starts getting nervous, followed by week 10 when the legal team demands a meeting. By week 12, the entire rollout pauses, not because the AI failed to deliver, but because Copilot finally revealed exactly what was already broken in your environment. You need to understand this one vital point. Copilot does not create problems, it exposes decisions. These are the decisions you made by omitting governance when you first set up the tenant. These choices calcified in month 3 when a team site defaulted to public, and they multiplied in month 6 when wide-open sharing became the path of least resistance for your staff. By month 12, this behavior was so normalized that no one even questioned why access was so broad. The exposure rate in your organization isn't a theoretical guess. Statistics show that 15% of business-critical files are overshared internally, while 17% are exposed externally. Even worse, over 3% of your most sensitive data is likely shared organization-wide without any restrictions at all. These numbers aren't just estimates from a textbook. They are hard measurements taken from remediation audits across every industry and geography. The shadow IT ecosystem only makes this situation more dangerous. The average organization has 975 unknown cloud services running right now, which is about 8 times more than IT thinks exists. These unauthorized services are where employees send the data they don't think M365 can handle, meaning your governance gaps have already pushed data outside your controlled tenant. You aren't actually protecting that information, you are just pretending you don't know it exists. In this environment, sensitivity labels start to feel like a ghost story that no one actually believes in. Files without any classification multiply across your environment, and Copilot outputs quickly lose their source classifications. You might assign a label to a document, but when Copilot summarizes it, that new summary has no label at all. This is how your intelligence debt grows, as every AI-generated output becomes a fresh piece of unclassified data that you've just created. Every derivative document is a new governance problem that the system generated without your intent, and now it sits unlabeled in a random OneDrive. This is the moment where the system decides your fate. It isn't acting out of malice or making a technical error. It is simply following the design you provided. You designed Entropy by leaving out governance, and now the system is showing you the results of that choice. When the project stalls at week 12, it isn't a failure of the Copilot software. It is a fundamental failure of architecture. Your architecture consisted of permissions without any constraints, sharing without classification, and access without a clear business justification. Copilot didn't create those flaws. It just made those invisible decisions visible to everyone. 73% of regulated organizations end up pausing their rollout at this exact stage. Once you see exactly what is exposed to the wrong people, you cannot unsee it. The compliance risk is now out in the open, the breach surface has been quantified, and your only remaining option is a massive remediation project. The other 27% of organizations never have to deal with this moment. They succeeded because they built an authorization compiler before they ever turned on the AI. They established identity controls before users formed bad habits, and they enforced classification before data relationships could calcify. For them, governance was the system itself, not just a phase of the project. When their pilot reaches week 6, there is nothing scandalous for the AI to expose. Entropy was never introduced into their environment, so the system is already making the correct decisions. In that architecture, Copilot becomes exactly what it was supposed to be, a productivity tool rather than a high-speed vulnerability scanner. That is the real architectural difference, and it isn't just about success or failure, but the gap between inevitable exposure and deliberate control. The 73% moment, regulated industries pause Copilot. This is the point where the pattern of failure becomes undeniable for everyone involved. 73% of organizations in regulated industries have been forced to pause their Copilot rollouts. We aren't just talking about small tests or limited pilots, but the full enterprise-wide rollouts that were supposed to transform the business. They have stopped dead in their tracks. This trend is hitting finance, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and government agencies the hardest. These are organizations where data exposure isn't just a theoretical risk or a minor headache. In these sectors, a leak is a compliance violation, a massive fine, and a formal regulatory response. These organizations have paused because they finally understand the stakes. The most important thing to realize is that this pause didn't happen because Copilot failed to work. Copilot works exactly as it was designed, aggregating data based on the permissions the user already holds. The pause happened because organizations finally realized what Copilot can actually access, and once they saw that reality, they understood they had never truly governed access in the first place. This is the moment where the flaws in your architecture become impossible to ignore. The trigger for this shutdown isn't a lack of capability in the AI, but a sudden surge in visibility. Copilot makes your messy permissions visible by showing you in plain language exactly what a user can reach. This isn't buried in an admin report or a compliance audit that no one reads. It happens right in the middle of a conversation. A user runs a simple query, and Copilot returns information that should have been locked down years ago. Suddenly, the governance gap that has been calcifying for 18 months is right in front of your face. This matters for regulated industries because these gaps don't stay quiet in an AI-driven environment. They become existential threats the moment an AI can aggregate that permissive access and expose it in an instant. Under normal circumstances, a user shouldn't be able to see financial forecasts, but they have access because the site defaulted to public and no one ever fixed it. In a standard M365 workflow, that gap stays invisible because it is passive. For a user to find that file, they would have to know it existed, navigate to the right folder, and manually download it. Copilot changes the math by making that discovery automatic. It can find that file, combine it with other data the user can access, and surface deep insights in a matter of seconds. The governance gap transforms from an invisible passive risk into an active high-speed exposure. For a regulated organization, this crosses a dangerous threshold. The active exposure of confidential data isn't just a minor compliance issue. It is a full-blown breach condition. The moment you realize Copilot can access something it shouldn't, you have to assume it has already been exposed. At that point, pausing the rollout is the only defensive move you have left. The actual cost of this pause is purely architectural. You have already sunk a massive investment into Copilot licensing, and you've spent months communicating the value of the tool to your users. You built the pilots and trained the staff, only to pull the plug right when things were supposed to scale. When you stop the rollout, user confusion starts to multiply. People want to know why the tool disappeared and why it was considered safe last week but risky today. The momentum you worked so hard to build simply evaporates. The real cost isn't just the wasted licensing fees. It is the loss of credibility and the signal you send to your workforce that you shipped a product you didn't actually understand. This architectural moment matters because the pause exposes the total absence of foundational governance. Organizations that stop their rollout aren't doing it because Copilot is a bad product. They are pausing because they finally looked at the system they built and saw nothing but entropy. They saw permission sprawl they had accepted as normal and classification that never actually happened. That is when leadership finally realizes they built the entire environment wrong from the very beginning. This mistake didn't start with the Copilot pilot. It started on day one of the original deployment. On that first day, they chose adoption velocity over governance, and they decided to build a permissive system with the hope of adding constraints later. That choice set in motion the entire cascade that made a week 12 shutdown inevitable. This was never a Copilot problem, but a governance problem that Copilot was kind enough to reveal. The 73% paused because their architecture was fundamentally incompatible with AI. The 27% never had to stop because their architecture was already sound from the start. That is the moment the difference between a secure system and a lucky one becomes clear. The entropy generators, what you unknowingly created. Now we need to look at what actually happened inside your environment while you were chasing adoption velocity. The foundational mistake is something you have likely already accepted as a cost of doing business. Naming conventions were never enforced. In the second month of your deployment, someone created a team called Team 1, followed quickly by Shared, Archive, and Projects FY24. Then came Projects and Projects FY25. And while each one had a legitimate reason at the moment of creation, they all felt like quick solutions to immediate needs. By month 18, your tenant had ballooned to 12,000 teams, leaving users unable to find anything and no one remembering which workspace was actually active. This led to a situation where nobody knew if the data in archive was truly archived or just abandoned in a digital graveyard. This isn't a mistake. This is entropy. Entropy always wins. The system is designed to create teams, and when no policy constrains that creation and no naming enforcement prevents duplication, the system does exactly what systems do. It multiplies. Every new team becomes a new permutation of the last one, and every new permutation introduces a fresh governance problem that must eventually be solved. This is the architectural reason why ungoverned teams sprawl exponentially rather than linearly. Then we have the issue of permission creep. Access expands. It never contracts. When someone joins a team and needs a specific folder, you grant it, and when they need a document library, you grant that too. 6 months pass and they switch roles, meaning they no longer need that access, yet the permissions remain exactly where you left them. This isn't an oversight, it is gravitational pull. Access has gravity, and once it is granted, it tends to stay granted because nobody benefits from the effort of removing it. Removing access costs time and invites user complaints, so the system simply accumulates. One user ends up with 7 unnecessary roles, 10 users hold on to outdated permissions, and soon 100 people are sitting on access they shouldn't have. By month 18, the average user has access to thousands of files they don't even know exist, and Copilot can discover those files instantly. Sensitivity labels should have been the foundation of your strategy, but in reality they were ignored. 90% of your files likely remain unlabeled because labeling requires intent and forces someone to pause and classify their work. Under a permissive system, there is no urgency and no consequence for failing to label, so the decision is made by default. The default is always unlabeled. The system then propagates this unlabeled data, and when Copilot processes it, there is no policy attached to the information. Nothing prevents the AI from surfacing it, and nothing prevents the output from being shared. This is why sensitivity labels are the ghost story of M365. Files without them become the invisible foundation of your organizational exposure. Shadow 8 is not a security problem. It is a symptom. Your employees are solving governance gaps by themselves because they cannot use Microsoft 365 the way they want. When they can't collaborate easily, they move to Dropbox, and when they can't apply the governance they need, they move to a personal ChatGPT instance. They build shadow workflows because they want to control their data in ways your system doesn't allow. Finding 975 unknown services in an organization isn't a sign of negligence. It is a sign of resistance. It is your workforce telling you that the system you built does not solve their actual problems. Orphaned sites and inactive groups are the infrastructure you simply forgot you created. A project ends, but the team, the site, and the data all remain because no one bothers to delete them. Deletion is an active choice that requires intent and invites the perceived risk of losing something important. Because of this, the decision is made by omission, and the default state becomes persistence. And when 38% of your teams are orphaned, over a third of your infrastructure is just accumulating. This grows your storage costs, expands your attack surface, and complicates your governance until the system becomes unmanageable. In architectural terms, none of these are mistakes. Every entropy generator is the inevitable result of absent governance. Naming conventions sprawl because you didn't enforce them, and permission creep happens because you didn't constrain the environment. Files remain unlabeled because you didn't make labeling mandatory, and shadow IT grows because you didn't provide viable alternatives. The system didn't fail, the system decided. In the absence of governance, the system defaults to maximum complexity and maximum permissiveness. You didn't design this chaos, but you inherited it the moment you chose adoption velocity over architectural intent. The cost equation: why reactive always costs 4x. Let's talk about money, because this is where architectural failure becomes a quantifiable disaster. Imagine you have 4,000 users on E3 licenses where the base cost is $36 per user every month. Your annual spend sits at roughly $1.7 million, but then Microsoft announces an 8% price increase. That extra $3 per user adds $144,000 to your yearly bill. For an organization of this size, that increase is significant but manageable, so you sting a bit and absorb it into the budget. Now add the cost of governance remediation to that predictable number. You are sitting on 12,000 teams where nearly 40% are orphaned and 17% of your sensitive files are accessible to the outside world. Your security team has finally looked at the data and they are panicking, while legal and the board are starting to demand answers. You begin remediation, and the choice is no longer abstract. You have to fix what you built. Here's the uncomfortable truth of the cost equation. First, you face the direct costs of external consulting. You cannot fix this internally because your team lacks the bandwidth and the specific expertise to untangle this web. You bring in a firm specializing in M365 governance, and the bill runs anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000. You are essentially paying strangers to understand the environment that you should have mastered in month one. Tooling costs come next. You realize you need Microsoft Purview, advanced monitoring, and license optimization tools that aren't included in your E3 bundle. These are expensive add-ons, but they are now non-negotiable because you desperately need visibility and automation to prevent this from happening again. You can expect to drop another $15,000 to $50,000 annually just for the software required to clean up the mess. Then there is the labor, which is where the cost becomes invisible but devastating. A proper remediation project takes about 9 months, and during that time, your internal teams are effectively frozen. SharePoint admins are stuck on site cleanup, while identity admins review broken permission structures and security teams try to implement sensitivity labels retroactively. These people are no longer working on new initiatives or enabling features that help the business. They are spending their careers reversing bad decisions made 18 months ago. When you calculate the salary and opportunity cost of this effort, you are looking at months of full-time equivalent work that produces nothing new. Your innovation team wanted to automate processes with Power Apps, but they are stuck on the governance project instead. Your business units wanted to scale teams to new departments, but they are waiting for a clean environment before they can expand. This compounds. Every month spent on remediation is a month where actual progress does not happen. The compounding effect is the real killer. Each month you ignore governance, the cleanup cost grows exponentially rather than linearly. In month 6, you might have 10,000 files that need labels, which is a manageable task for a small team. By month 18, that number has jumped to 35,000 files, and now you have permission sprawl across hundreds of new teams created while you were looking the other way. The surface area you need to fix keeps expanding, and every day you wait multiplies the total scope of the project. The proactive alternative looks very different. The organizations that don't stall during their Copilot deployment have already paid these costs, but they paid them on a much better timeline. They spent the money when there were 10 teams instead of 12,000, and they set the rules when permission structures were still forming. Implementing governance upfront for a 4,000-seat organization might cost $150,000 for the planning, architecture, and training. It happens in 90 days, and more importantly, it only happens once. The cost of reactive remediation for that same organization is 3 to 8 times higher. It stretches over the better part of a year, consumes your entire team's capacity, and creates massive friction for your users. The math is simple. Proactive governance costs $1 to prevent the problem, while reactive governance costs $4 to fix it. But here is the architectural truth, that $4 of remediation doesn't actually solve the problem. It just makes the mess manageable. You never fully recover from governance that was omitted at the start, so you end up managing the debt forever. You patch it, you monitor it, and you pray that no new exposure occurs. The organizations that didn't stall spent their $1 and moved on. Their governance is baked into the system, it scales naturally, and it doesn't require perpetual cleanup. This is what the cost equation is really telling you. It isn't just about the budget, it is the difference between solving a problem once and managing a failure forever. Case Study 1. The excavation, post-facto failure. Let me show you exactly what this architectural erosion looks like when it hits the real world. We are looking at a real organization with 2,800 users running on an E3 tenant that had been active for 3 years. They operated with no formal governance framework. And while those numbers are specific to them, the outcome is something I see with haunting consistency. When this group first deployed, they made the comfortable choice we have been dissecting, which was to prioritize a fast go-live and worry about governance later. For the first 18 months, that decision actually looked like a stroke of genius because adoption was clean and the users were happy. Leadership saw a system that appeared to be working perfectly, but they were simply watching the fuse burn on a massive pile of digital debt. By the time they hit month 36, the environment had devolved into what I call conditional chaos. They had 12,000 Teams sites cluttering the tenant, and 38% of those were orphaned shells with no active owners. Even worse, 17% of those sites contained files shared externally that never should have left the building, and 75% of their data had no sensitivity labels at all. 623 guests still had persistent access to sensitive repositories long after their projects ended. Yet the organization never formally assessed this oversharing because doing so meant admitting the problem existed. This mess was their baseline, and it wasn't the result of a single mistake or some specific act of negligence. It was the natural, inevitable result of omitting governance from the start, which allowed the system to default to a permissive state. They didn't just have a messy tenant, they had designed a system that decided to be insecure by default. Then Copilot entered the picture. The first week of the pilot was filled with the usual enthusiasm, and by week 2, everyone was excited about the obvious productivity gains. That changed in week 6, when users started reporting that Copilot was surfacing highly confidential information in standard chat responses. It pulled up an HR document detailing upcoming organizational changes and a financial forecast meant only for the executive suite. These documents lived in sites the users technically had permission to access, so Copilot found them, aggregated the data, and surfaced it exactly as it was designed to do. At that moment, the organization was forced to actually look at the architecture they had built, and all they saw was entropy. They were staring at 12,000 teams and files scattered across repositories with zero classification. Permissions had accumulated over 3 years like plaque in an artery, and because there had been no reviews, the legal and security teams had to halt the pilot immediately. They reached the unavoidable conclusion that they couldn't deploy Copilot without knowing what it could access, and they couldn't know that without fixing the infrastructure they had ignored for years. This is where the excavation began. It took 9 months and a specialized external consulting firm to begin digging through the layers of calcified data. Internal teams were pulled off their actual jobs and frozen on this remediation project, which turned into a methodical but brutal process of digital archaeology. During the inventory phase, they spent 6 weeks cataloging every team, every guest, and every permission structure in the tenant. They discovered a SharePoint site from month 4 that everyone had forgotten, along with guest accounts from mergers that happened 3 years ago. They even found department heads who still held platform admin rights they had been granted once for a specific task and never relinquished. The classification phase was even more painful, as they had to apply sensitivity labels retroactively to 12,000 files. This wasn't something they could just automate. It was manual labor at a massive scale that required admins to review documents and determine their classification one by one. The process was naturally error-prone and completely overwhelming, dragging on for 4 full months. Finally, they moved into the cleanup phase to delete obsolete teams and reclaim guest access. They had to check if anyone was still using orphaned sites before hitting delete, and they had to confirm every guest's status before cutting them off. This created massive friction with the user base, who constantly asked why their access was disappearing or why their favorite team was gone. The answers were honest but painful. The organization was finally governing what it should have governed years ago. The financial cost of this delay was staggering. They spent $300,000 on consultants, $50,000 on new tooling, and another $30,000 in internal salary costs for the frozen teams. The opportunity cost was even higher, as innovation stalled and major initiatives were deferred while they excavated a foundation that should have been poured on day one. When you add it up, they spent $380,000 and 9 months of time for a single organization of 2,800 users. The architectural truth they learned is that you don't deploy governance after the fact, you excavate it. They had to tear apart a system that was 3 years calcified while it was still running, and the Copilot pilot never actually resumed. The pause became a stall, and the stall eventually became a total shutdown. This is what the 73% of organizations experience when they realize their architecture is wrong. Copilot doesn't fail because the technology is broken. It fails because finally someone looked at what they built and realized they didn't understand it. Case study 2, the compilation, proactive success. Now I want you to contrast that failure with a model that actually works. This second case study involves 1,200 users in a greenfield deployment, meaning they had a blank slate with no legacy infrastructure or years of bad decisions. They had the same choice as the first group, but they chose to prioritize architecture over immediate gratification. They decided on a governance-first approach, which meant the first 30 days had nothing to do with provisioning users. Instead, they focused entirely on the Entra ID baseline to define what least privilege actually looked like for their specific needs. They identified the core roles and the permissions those roles required to function, rather than granting the permissions users asked for or the ones that felt safe to a distracted admin. Naming conventions were established and enforced before a single team was ever created. They set teams to private by default, organized site collections under a strict taxonomy, and ensured guests couldn't be added without a formal request and approval process. These weren't just suggestions written in a PDF, they were technical enforcements built into the system. The environment simply wouldn't allow a user to create a team that violated the naming standard or share data with everyone by default. The system made the right decisions because it had been told exactly how to behave. They handled sensitivity labels with the same level of foresight. Rather than waiting for data to pile up, they attached labels to default document libraries before the first file was ever uploaded. When a user created a document, the correct label appeared automatically based on where it was stored. Users could override the label if they had a reason, but the default was always correct, ensuring no files grew up unlabeled in the dark. Next, they layered in the actual policies for DLP, conditional access, and lifecycle management. They didn't just turn these on in production and hope for the best. They tested them in a pilot environment first. They verified that the rules enforced what was necessary without strangling the actual work people needed to do. By the time they brought the 1,200 users online at the 90-day mark, the entire infrastructure was active and every enforcement was in place. The outcomes of this proactive work speak for themselves. Less than 3% of their files were ever overshared because the system defaulted to private by design. Sharing a file required a conscious, intentional act from the user, which turned exposure into the rare exception rather than the standard state of the tenant. They also had 0 orphaned teams because they implemented a lifecycle policy from the start. When a team became inactive, the system flagged it automatically and notified the owner. If no one confirmed the team was still needed, it was archived and removed from the active environment. Governance was maintained because the system was designed to prevent accumulation unless someone made an active choice to keep a resource alive. When they deployed Copilot in month 4, there was no crisis and no week 12 stall. Users received access, the tool worked as intended, and every piece of information it surfaced was already properly classified and governed. Copilot was safe because the system it was searching had been built correctly from the very first hour. The total cost for this success was $90,000, covering the planning, architecture, and training. It happened once, it took 90 days, and then it was finished. The architectural truth here is that this organization didn't just manage Microsoft 365, they compiled it. They wrote the rules into the foundation, and the system enforced those rules forever. Every new user and every new file inherited that governance automatically, meaning the system was making the right decisions by design rather than by accident. This is the distinction that the 27% of successful organizations understand. Governance isn't a phase you get to later. It is the operating system of the entire environment. When you build it first, the rest of the platform flows through it, but when you build it later, you spend nearly $400,000 just to dig yourself out of a hole. The difference isn't about complexity, it is entirely about timing. Governance in month 1 is an investment, but governance in month 18 is just an expensive way to fix a system you never should have built that way in the first place. The identity foundation, where it actually starts. If governance has a true starting point, this is it. It is not found in your policy documents, your sensitivity labels, or your DLP rules. It starts with identity. In architectural terms, Entra ID functions as the authorization compiler. Every single access decision within Microsoft 365 must flow through identity, whether that is a data access request, a sharing event, or a basic permission check. Everything goes through Entra ID. The moment you establish an identity, you have actually established the foundation for every single decision that follows. This is an architectural reality rather than a philosophy. You simply cannot govern a resource you cannot identify, just as you cannot enforce policy on access you cannot attribute to a specific actor. You will never remediate exposure from users you cannot account for, because identity is where the system decides who gets to do what. Everything else in your environment is just downstream of that one decision. Most organizations make a foundational mistake by treating identity as infrastructure while viewing governance as a separate task. They believe Entra ID exists just to provision users, get people their email, and grant them access to Teams. Then they try to think about governance later, as if it were a layer sitting on top. They assume they can grant access first, and then figure out how to govern that access once it is already in use. That logic is completely inverted. Governance actually begins with identity. When you establish who a user is and define their specific role, you have already established what they should be allowed to access. The principle of least privilege does not mean you restrict access after the fact. It means you grant only what the role requires and nothing more. That principle is enforced at the identity level within Entra ID before a user ever touches a single file. The distinction between access granted and access justified is everything. Access granted just means you gave someone permission by assigning a role or adding them to a group. Access justified means that the permission is strictly necessary for them to do their job, making it auditable, defensible, and tied to a business function instead of a personal favor. Most organizations are good at granting access, but very few ever justify it. Over-permissioning becomes the default state when identity governance is omitted from the design. When a new user joins a department and needs their files, you naturally add them to the department group. However, that group has likely existed for 3 years and has accumulated permissions from every project it ever touched. By adding the new user, you have inadvertently given them access to old project files and sensitive resources that have nothing to do with their current role. This architectural erosion happens in days rather than months. It only takes one user and one department group with 3 years of accumulated permissions to create a gap. When you scale that behavior across 800 users and 20 departments over 6 years of organizational evolution, you end up with a permission structure that nobody can map or defend. You cannot rationalize the environment except to say that the user is in the group, so they have the access. This is exactly why 15% of business-critical files end up overshared across the enterprise. This does not happen through malice or simple human error, but through identity decisions made without any business justification. Users inherited access. That access propagated through the system, and the system default was to keep it forever. There is a massive architectural cost to this, because when identity governance is ignored, fixing the mess requires touching every single resource. You have to go through every SharePoint site, every Teams channel, and every document library to review the rules. Because those permissions were never justified when they were created, you are forced to review everything manually. If identity had been governed from the start, you would have clear role definitions and justified access requirements for every permission. When an employee changes roles, the system would simply remove the old permissions and grant new ones based on the new requirements. That process is clean, auditable, and scalable. Without that governance, you are left with conditional chaos. When someone changes roles, you likely won't remove their old permissions because you don't actually know what they have. You just keep adding new permissions until they have accumulated 7 different roles across the company. When you finally perform an audit, you will discover that 30% of your organization has access to things that make no sense for what they do today. The cost of fixing identity after the fact eventually approaches the cost of rebuilding your entire system from scratch. You have to review every user and every group to justify what stays and what goes. The labor cost is catastrophic, the risk is high, and users will inevitably complain when the access they relied on is suddenly removed. The 27% of organizations that do not stall understood this from the beginning. They established Entra ID governance on day 1 with defined roles and permissions tied strictly to business functions. Because access reviews were built into the design, the system knows exactly what to remove when someone moves departments. Identity becomes the operating system, and everything else flows naturally from it. The 73% that paused their rollout treated identity as a simple provisioning tool. They granted access without ever justifying it, and by month 18, they realized their foundation was just pure entropy. Now they are forced to rebuild the foundation while the building is still occupied. This is the architectural reality of the platform, and everything else you build depends on it. The data classification blind spot. This is the specific area where most organizations are completely blind. Sensitivity labels are the foundation for everything downstream, yet many treat them as optional infrastructure or a simple compliance checkbox. Only 10% of companies have actually labeled their files properly, which means 90% of organizations are operating with unclassified data. That unclassified data is exactly what creates your intelligence debt. Sensitivity labels are the only way the system knows what it needs to protect. When a file is labeled as confidential, that label carries specific rules regarding who can access it and how it can be shared. The label is the policy itself, and without it, the file just exists in an unprotected state. It remains unclassified and available to anyone who happens to have access to the location. The common blind spot is that organizations think labeling is just a compliance activity for groups regulated by GDPR or HIPAA. They assume that if they aren't in a regulated industry, they can simply do the labeling later. That thinking is inverted because labeling is actually an architectural requirement. It is how the system identifies the data, how DLP policies know what to enforce, and how Copilot knows what it can safely process. Without these labels, your data remains invisible to every policy enforcement mechanism you have in place. A DLP policy might be set to prevent external sharing of financial data, but the system has no way of knowing which files are financial. Unless someone has classified the file, the DLP engine cannot match it to the rule. The policy fails silently, the file gets shared, and your security rule is never actually enforced. This is the architecture of failure. You write your policies and assume you are protected, but the policies have nothing to match against. 90% of your data is currently invisible to your DLP policies and is available to Copilot without any classification attached. Because there is no label to trigger enforcement, 90% of your files are subject to no actual control. When Copilot enters this environment, it begins processing those unlabeled files to generate new responses. This is where the problem gets worse because the AI output does not automatically inherit the label of the source material. If Copilot summarizes a confidential document, that summary starts its life with no label at all. The system does not inherently know that the new content is also confidential, so the output becomes unclassified data. Now you have a derivative summary of sensitive information that carries no restrictions or protections. It can be shared, accessed, or leaked because it was never classified by the system. This is the definition of intelligence debt, where every AI output that isn't labeled becomes a brand new governance problem. The system created the data, but because it doesn't know what it is, it cannot protect it. The result is that DLP policies designed to prevent exposure fail the moment Copilot touches the data. You might think your confidential files are safe, but the moment a summary is generated, that protection vanishes. The unclassified output can leave your tenant through a Teams chat or an email because there was no label to trigger a block. This is why the 73% of organizations eventually pause their Copilot rollout. It isn't because the AI is inherently dangerous, but because their data is unclassified. Unclassified data in an AI system is architecturally the same as unencrypted data in a database. You would never ship a database without encryption, yet many organizations ship AI systems where 90% of the inputs are unclassified. The truth is that you cannot protect what you do not classify, and you cannot classify what you do not govern. Classification requires a level of intent and a governance structure that enforces it. Without that structure, labeling becomes an optional task that people ignore, and the system defaults to being unclassified. The 27% of successful organizations understood this and enforced labeling before they ever stored their data. They ensured that sensitivity labels came before the content itself, so the system was told everything had to be classified. This wasn't just a policy, it was a design choice where files could not exist without a label. The other 73% left their labeling to chance and hoped that employees would do the right thing. They didn't, and the resulting intelligence debt accumulated until the exposure became impossible to ignore. This is the blind spot that you cannot see until you actually look for it. The shadow IT ecosystem, your unmanaged tenant. You likely believe you are operating a single tenant, but the architectural reality is that you are actually running several. The official environment is Microsoft 365, which is the one you are currently managing, or perhaps just pretending to manage while the real work happens elsewhere. Parallel to your sanctioned infrastructure sits the unofficial tenant, which is the one your organization actually relies on to function. Data suggests the average organization operates 975 unknown cloud services, and these do not exist alongside Microsoft 365 as supplements, they exist instead of it. When you scan network traffic and audit SaaS access logs, you find 8 times more services than IT even knows exist, which is not a measurement error or a loose estimate. It is the inevitable result of users seeking the path of least resistance when your official tools fail them. This is the uncomfortable truth. Shadow IT is not a security problem, but a governance symptom. You cannot treat the symptom without understanding the underlying disease. Employees adopt these external services because Microsoft 365 is not solving their actual problems, and they feel they cannot control data or move fast enough within your constraints. When users cannot integrate systems or apply the specific governance their department needs, they simply solve the problem themselves. They find a tool that works, they use it, and then they tell a colleague who does the same until the practice spreads across the entire floor. By the time IT discovers the tool 6 months later and writes a policy to ban it, the service is already embedded in 17 different departments. Because blocking it now would effectively break the business, IT eventually accommodates the risk, documents the exception, and accepts the new entropy. This cycle repeats 975 times. Shadow it does not grow through employee negligence, but through a rational response to your governance failure. Your organization is telling you through its behavior that your implementation of Microsoft 365 does not meet its needs. Yet instead of hearing that message, you continue to block the very tools they use to stay productive. Shadow AI is the current evolution of this same pattern. Employees are now using ChatGPT for work, Gemini for analysis, and Claude for summarization because your internal governance is either too restrictive or entirely non-existent. They need an AI tool that moves faster than your bureaucracy, so they paste sensitive work data into a public LLM to get the analysis they need and move on. That data is now living outside your tenant, outside your DLP, and outside your control forever. This shadow AI is far more dangerous than traditional shadow IT because it is functionally invisible. There is no persistent service to audit and no specific tool to scan for, leaving only browser tabs and transient interactions behind. You are left with no durable artifact of the breach except for the data you already uploaded to a third party. The cost of this fragmentation is measurable in data leakage, compliance violations, and lost visibility. You are likely paying a massive operational tax by funding redundant tools that serve the same functions as the software you are already licensed for. Your organization is essentially running two parallel systems, which leads to duplicated work and a fractured workflow that slows everyone down. Architecturally speaking, shadow IT exists because your governance team failed to build a functional authorization compiler. Every shadow service you find is evidence of a governance gap or an unmet need that you didn't solve, forcing the organization to solve it for itself. The foundational mistake is trying to block these services without fixing the underlying M365 architecture. When you write policies to block personal email or restrict browser access, the shadow ecosystem simply moves deeper underground. Employees find workarounds like VPNs and personal devices, which causes your visibility to decrease while your actual risk increases. You are treating the symptom without curing the disease by saying no, without offering a viable alternative. The 27% of organizations that don't stall understand that you don't stop shadow IT by blocking it, but by eliminating the reason for its existence. They made their official tenant so capable and well-architected that employees had no reason to look elsewhere. The 73% that pause are currently drowning in nearly 1,000 shadow services because their official system failed to provide a clear path. They cannot block the shadow ecosystem now because the business depends on it to survive. This is what happens when you omit governance from the start. The system decides to build a second infrastructure around you. The sprawl effect, teams and sites as entropy. When governance does not constrain growth, infrastructure behaves like a biological organism. Teams proliferate not as a metaphor, but as the default behavior of an ungoverned system where the answer to every request is a silent yes. Because nothing enforces constraints or asks if a new team actually needs to exist, the system defaults to creation, growth, and eventual entropy. In an environment without rules, teams are created daily and at a rate much faster than they are ever deleted. A project spins up and a team is born, but when that project ends, the team persists indefinitely. No one deletes it because they might need the history or a specific file later, so the container sits there inactive and accumulating. Storage costs rise and governance complexity expands, yet the team remains because deletion requires a decision that no one is empowered to make. This is orphaned infrastructure. These sites are not abandoned in the traditional sense, but they have no owner and no one responsible for their life cycle. They are simply there, growing the size of your tenant and the complexity of your environment without providing any ongoing value. The sprawl effect is made worse by naming conventions that were never enforced by design. Without rules, every new team becomes a confusing variation of the last, leading to a list of final and real versions that make it impossible to find the source of truth. These are not user mistakes, but the inevitable result of a system that offers no enforcement. By the 18th month of operation, you might have 17 different teams with projects in the title, and no one knows which one contains the active data. Each of these teams consumes SharePoint storage, and the math of that accumulation is relentless. If you have 12,000 teams and nearly 40% are orphaned, you are paying to store data in over 4,000 containers that no one has touched in a year. The cost does not arrive in a dramatic spike, but in quiet monthly additions that eventually break the budget. Complexity is a much larger threat than the storage bill. Each team represents a separate authorization context with its own guests, sharing rules and accumulated permissions. You cannot manually review 12,000 independent contexts, and you certainly cannot maintain security standards across that much sprawl. Your admins eventually spend all their time managing the mess instead of enforcing high-level governance. The architectural problem here is the total absence of an expiration policy or a defined life cycle. A simple rule could flag inactive teams for the owner and archive them automatically, but that requires a governance framework to exist in the first place. Without that framework, the default state of the system is permanent persistence. Cleaning up this sprawl is exponentially harder than preventing it from the start. Once you hit 12,000 teams, cataloging them becomes a massive project that requires engagement from owners who may have already left the company. Deleting anything without confirmation risks losing valuable data, so the teams stay, and the sprawl becomes a permanent fixture of your environment. The 27% of successful organizations prevented this by enforcing naming conventions and lifecycle policies at the moment of creation. They set teams to private by default and used automation to archive or delete inactive containers without human intervention. The system made the cleanup decisions consistently because it had been told exactly how to handle entropy. The 73% that struggle simply let the containers pile up until cleanup became an archaeological excavation. They are now discovering dependencies they never documented and paying the high price of governing a system that has already decided to sprawl. This is entropy in its purest form. Uncontrolled growth and complexity expanding to fill every available space because the system was allowed to be too permissive. The licensing waste, paying for ghosts. Right now, something is happening inside your tenant that you likely haven't noticed, and it involves you paying for resources that do not actually exist. This isn't a metaphorical problem or a rounding error. It is a literal drain on your budget where 10 to 20% of your total license count is currently assigned to identities that are inactive, over-licensed, or simply forgotten by the system. The math behind this architectural erosion is devastatingly simple. If you have 1,000 users on an E3 plan at $36 per user, your annual spend sits at $432,000. A 15% waste ratio in that environment means you are handing Microsoft $64,800 every year for licenses that provide zero functional value to the organization. This waste does not stem from simple negligence or a lack of effort by your IT staff, but rather from a total absence of automated governance. Inactive users represent the first major category of this financial entropy. When an employee leaves the organization and their account is disabled, the license often remains attached to that dead identity because reclaiming it requires a deliberate manual process. Someone has to notice the account is disabled, someone has to decide to pull the license, and someone has to actually click the button to execute that change. In the absence of a defined workflow, the default behavior is to leave the license assigned, meaning the user is gone, but the billing persists month after month and year after year. It is not uncommon for us to discover premium licenses still assigned to people who left the company 3 years ago. Over-licensing is the second category where costs spiral out of control. An E5 license costs $60 per month, while an E3 costs $36, creating a $24 gap that represents a 40% price jump. Most of that premium covers advanced security features, like risk-based access and privileged identity management, which are vital for security-sensitive roles but entirely unnecessary for frontline workers or administrative assistants. Despite this, E5 is frequently treated as the universal default because assigning one high-level license to everyone is easier than auditing who actually needs those specific tools. The system defaults to simplicity. And in the Microsoft ecosystem, simplicity is an incredibly expensive luxury. When Microsoft announces a price increase, like the upcoming 5% bump for E5, this hidden over-licensing suddenly becomes a visible liability. That user who never needed the premium features is now costing you even more than they were yesterday, making the waste quantifiable in a way that leadership can no longer ignore. The increase didn't create the problem, it just exposed the inefficiency that was already baked into your tenant design. This is where proactive governance changes the financial trajectory of the platform. If you had established role-based licensing from the start, you would know that accounting team members require E3 with specific add-ons rather than a full E5 suite. Sales reps might need E3 paired with Power Apps, but they certainly don't require Defender for Identity to perform their daily tasks. If governance had defined these roles at the outset, remediation would be a simple matter of aligning the license to the persona and capturing the savings immediately. Without that governance framework, you are left with a state of conditional chaos where nobody knows why specific users have premium access. You hesitate to remove licenses because you don't know if doing so will break a critical workflow, so you conduct a slow manual audit instead. By the time you've confirmed that a user doesn't need their E5, months of overpayment have already vanished into the cloud. You are essentially funding your own inefficiency because efficiency requires a level of architectural intent that most organizations have chosen to ignore. The system isn't doing this to you. You are doing it to yourself by letting the default settings dictate your spend. The DLP failure, why policies don't enforce. This is the specific point where your security policy meets reality and loses the battle. You have likely written extensive data loss prevention rules designed to prevent external sharing of financial data or to block credit card numbers from leaving via email. These rules make the organization feel protected, but in practice, they are often completely toothless. The foundational mistake is treating DLP as an independent security control when it is actually a downstream dependency. DLP policies function by matching on signals, asking the system if a specific piece of data matches a forbidden pattern or a specific label. If a file is explicitly marked as confidential, the policy triggers and blocks the transfer, but if that same data is unlabeled, the policy has no signal to act upon. Because 90% of files in the average tenant are completely unlabeled, 90% of your data is effectively invisible to your security rules. This creates an architecture of failure where you've written rules that only apply to a tiny fraction of your digital estate. The rest of your data moves freely and undetected because there is no metadata telling the policy what the content actually represents. When Copilot enters this environment, the problem scales exponentially. Copilot processes unclassified data without hesitation, and if a financial forecast isn't labeled, Copilot won't know it's sensitive and the DLP policy won't know to stop the processing. The result is the creation of derivative data, summaries or chats generated by AI that inherit the lack of classification from the source material. This sensitive information then gets shared in Teams or forwarded in emails because the DLP rule had nothing to match against during the initial interaction. It isn't that Copilot bypassed your security, it's that your security was waiting for a classification signal that never arrived. You cannot block what you cannot identify, and you cannot identify what you haven't bothered to classify. The root cause of this exposure is almost always internal oversharing. Statistics show that 83% of at-risk files are overshared within the organization, meaning the users have legitimate permissions to data they should never have seen. DLP is designed to stop unauthorized movement to external parties, but it ignores internal movement where the permission was technically granted by a flawed site design. If a user has access to a folder they shouldn't, DLP sees their activity as normal and allows the data to be moved, copied, or manipulated. When organizations realize their data is leaking, they usually respond by adding more aggressive constraints and blocking common tools like Dropbox or personal email attachments. This creates friction without creating governance, which inevitably forces users to find creative workarounds to get their jobs done. They start copying text into email bodies or downloading files to personal devices, moving the behavior into dark corners of the network where your policies have no visibility at all. The blocking doesn't work because blocking is not a substitute for architectural intent. Real governance happens upstream by ensuring that only the people who truly need access are granted it in the first place. This prevents the unauthorized sharing before it ever reaches the DLP layer, removing the user's need to seek out a workaround. The architectural requirement is an immutable sequence. Governance must come first to define access, classification must come second to identify the data, and only then can DLP function as an enforcement mechanism. If you skip the first two steps, your DLP rules are just writing checks that your underlying architecture cannot cache. The organizations that successfully secure their data understand this hierarchy, while the rest continue to wonder why their expensive security tools keep failing to stop the bleed. The agent sprawl problem. AI amplifies everything. Now we need to address the specific crisis you likely haven't encountered yet, mostly because it hasn't fully arrived on your doorstep. It is coming, and when it finally hits your environment, the impact will be exponentially more severe than any of the sprawl issues we have already discussed. Current data shows that 80% of Fortune 500 companies are already running active AI agents within their ecosystems. These are not basic Copilot chat interfaces, but rather autonomous agents that operate as proxy systems for your users. These entities make independent decisions and access sensitive data to perform complex work without any human intervention or oversight. 1 million of these agents have already been created, yet they weren't deployed through a careful pilot or governed by a security framework. They were simply spun up in Copilot Studio, the Power Platform, and various Azure AI services. You now have 1 million autonomous systems operating inside Microsoft 365 environments using governance structures that were built for humans instead of machines. By the year 28, IDC projects that we will see 1.3 billion agents in active use across the global enterprise. Moving from 1 million to over 1 billion represents a 300-fold increase in entities operating across a cloud infrastructure that was never designed to manage them. This is not a simple matter of scaling up your existing help desk or support teams, because it is a fundamental architectural failure. The same broken logic that failed to govern human sprawl will fail even more catastrophically when it tries to restrain 1 billion machines. Most organizations fail to realize that agents do not solve your underlying governance problems, but instead they actually inherit them. When an agent is provisioned, it requires data access to be useful, so it naturally inherits the full permission set of the user who created it. It can see every file and folder that the human can see, but these agents lack human judgment and the natural hesitation that keeps a person from opening a file they shouldn't. They do not pause to ask for permission or double-check the sensitivity of a document before they process it. They simply access every single thing they are permitted to touch immediately and at a massive scale. An agent can ingest and process in mere minutes what would normally take a human employee several days to read. This means the over-permissioning that already plagues your human users becomes a total catastrophe when it is multiplied by the speed of an AI. Consider a scenario where an agent is designed to analyze sales data and gets provisioned with access to the latest sales forecast. While that seems fine, the sales forecast is often stored in a SharePoint site that also houses customer contracts, competitor analysis, and sensitive internal margin discussions. The agent now has full access to all of that data, not because a developer intended for it to happen, but because the underlying permission structure never placed a constraint on it. The agent simply inherited the access that was already there, the system defaulted to being permissive, and the agent then amplified that openness across every data source it could reach. If you multiply that single failure by 1 million agents, you start to see the scope of the intelligence debt you are accruing. Every one of those agents is inheriting permissions and accessing data it probably shouldn't be touching while generating new outputs based on that information. Each of those outputs is a new piece of data that is currently untracked, unlabeled, and completely invisible to your traditional governance tools. The architectural problem that actually matters here is that agents are creators of data rather than just consumers of it. When an agent analyzes a dataset and generates a summary report, that report constitutes entirely new data that must live somewhere in your tenant. You have to ask who can access that report, whether it is properly labeled, and if it correctly inherits the sensitivity of the source data it was built from. In the vast majority of Microsoft 365 environments, the answer to those questions is a resounding no. The output is just a raw file that sits unclassified and untracked, waiting for anyone with access to that storage location to find it. This is how you end up with governance failures at a massive scale, and the problem isn't even in your source data anymore. The failure lives in the derivative data that the agents created, which carries the intelligence of sensitive sources without carrying any of the original classifications or policies. The system scales these agents simply because it has the technical capacity to do so, and there is currently no governance layer constraining their creation. Most organizations lack a policy stating that agents require explicit approval or that they can only touch specific whitelisted data sources. There is no lifecycle management for these entities, so the system just decides to create as many as the users ask for. We are moving toward 1.3 billion agents because the system is designed to favor expansion over control. This is the exact moment where entropy stops being a theoretical concept and becomes a concrete failure of the entire environment. We are no longer talking about 12,000 abandoned Teams channels that nobody is managing, but rather a billion agents propagating intelligence through your tenant without a single policy to guide them. The timing of this is particularly bad because most of you haven't even finished governing your human users yet. You are still drowning in Teams sprawl, still discovering massive oversharing issues, and still trying to roll out sensitivity labels years after the data was created. While you struggle with those basics, the system is preparing to drop a billion agents into that same ungoverned mess. The top 27% of architects will see this coming and realize that agents actually require much stricter governance than humans do. Because agents are faster and entirely tireless, they will never question a bad decision and will simply execute whatever they are told to do. This means your governance has to be perfect, and it has to happen upstream at the architectural level before the agent is ever allowed to exist. The other 73% will miss the warning signs and deploy agents simply because the feature is available and the business is screaming for automation. Somewhere between 6 and 12 months later, they will realize these agents are leaking sensitive reports and moving information through channels that governance never even considered. The cleanup will have to begin all over again, but this time you will be trying to fix a billion-scale problem. This is the inevitable result of choosing rapid adoption over sound architecture. You start with Teams sprawl, move into Copilot exposure, and end up with a total failure of agent governance. Each mistake amplifies the one before it, proving that the foundation was never actually built but was merely assumed to exist. The system decides how to behave, and if you don't provide the rules, it will always decide to scale your entropy. The compliance trap, regulations expose architecture. You should view compliance frameworks as nothing more than a way to measure your accumulated governance debt. Regulators won't put it that way, but when GDPR auditors show up to check your data handling, they aren't just looking for violations. They are looking for the architecture you were supposed to build but decided to skip. When HIPAA inspectors ask for evidence of your access controls, they aren't creating new problems for your IT team, but are instead exposing the holes that have been there for years. Auditors for SOX aren't trying to impose a burden when they ask for access records, as they are simply demanding visibility into a system you have been running in the dark. Regulations like the EU AI Act, GDPR, and HIPAA are not just separate sets of rules you bolt onto your Microsoft 365 tenant. They are actually detailed descriptions of what your governance should look like if it were actually being enforced. When you sit down to read these regulations, you are essentially reading an architecture specification for your environment. They outline the requirements for data lineage, access justification, and controlled data flows that we have been talking about this entire time. The only difference is that these are written as legal requirements instead of architectural choices. During a typical compliance audit, the inspector will start by asking to see your data governance framework and most of the time it simply doesn't exist. When they move to the next question and ask how you know who accessed specific files, you might point them toward your audit logs. Those logs contain millions of unsorted and unanalyzed entries that provide no real insight into behavior. If they ask you to identify exactly where customer data is stored, you won't be able to answer without a manual review of thousands of individual files. You might try to show off your DLP policies as a way to prevent data leaks, but those policies are usually written against unclassified data. They have nothing to match against, which means they exist on a piece of paper but never actually function in practice. The findings from these auditors are remarkably consistent across every industry and every size of organization. They find a total lack of data lineage, no real justification for access, and a complete absence of audit evidence. These gaps aren't unique to your specific company, but are structural failures that occur whenever governance is ignored in favor of speed. Most organizations look at the resulting fines as the primary cost of being non-compliant. They see a $100,000 penalty or $1 million fine as a quantifiable expense that they can pay once and move on from. In reality, those fines are the cheapest part of the entire process. The truly expensive consequences are the ones you can't see on a balance sheet right away, such as mandatory remediation. These are the audit findings that legally force you to go back and do the architectural work you should have done years ago. You end up under consent decrees that mandate massive governance improvements and ongoing monitoring that lasts for years. The real cost is found in the quarterly audits, the endless documentation obligations, and the constant cycle of testing and retesting. This is exactly why 73% of organizations in regulated industries decided to pause their Copilot rollouts. It wasn't because they thought the AI was inherently dangerous, but because they knew a compliance audit was inevitable. They realized that when an auditor asked how they were protecting health information or financial data from AI exposure, they would have no answer. Since the governance structure to answer that question didn't exist, they chose to stop the deployment rather than create massive regulatory exposure. The biggest mistake organizations make is trying to get compliant as if it were a project with a finish line. They hire expensive consultants to write policies and document procedures just so they can pass an audit and check a box. This is nothing more than compliance theater, where you create a mountain of paperwork to describe a governance system you don't actually have. The auditor sees a document that says you have access controls and audit trails, but the underlying system is still doing exactly what it has always done. It is still creating and sharing data without any classification or justification. Your documentation is just proof that you know what good governance looks like, not proof that you have actually implemented it. There is an uncomfortable truth that regulators understand but rarely say out loud. Compliance is not a layer you can add to a broken system. It is the natural consequence of having a proper architecture in place from the beginning. If your governance is built correctly, passing an audit becomes an automatic process because the evidence already exists. Your logs show justified access because you handled that at the provisioning stage, and your data is classified because that happened the moment it was created. The audit passes because the system is actually compliant in its daily operations, not because you wrote a policy manual. The 73% of companies that paused their rollouts understood this fundamental reality. They knew the audit would immediately expose the gap between their marketing and their architecture, so they chose to wait. They are building the foundation first, so that when they finally deploy, the audits will pass because the system actually works as intended. The 90-day governance blueprint, the 27% path. Here is what actually works. If you find yourself among the 73% and you are tired of excavating your own environment, you need the architecture that prevents the mess in the first place. This approach is not faster than a standard deployment, but it is correct, and that distinction matters. The 27% who never stall simply chose to be correct instead of being fast. The blueprint requires 90 days divided into 3 distinct phases of 30 days each. This isn't because 30 days is a magic number, but because the sequence of operations is absolute. You start with identity, move to classification, and finish with enforcement. You cannot skip these steps or reorder them because the architecture will not hold if the foundation is missing. Phase 1 covers days 1 through 30, focusing entirely on your baseline assessment and identity foundation. Everything in the ecosystem flows from this point. You must establish an intra-ID governance baseline by defining roles based on actual organizational functions rather than arbitrary titles. Whether someone is an accountant, a salesperson, or a frontline worker, you must determine what they actually need to do their job. You are not asking them what they want or what seems safe. You are documenting the specific permissions required for their work to create a definitive source of truth. Once defined, you enforce these roles through technical controls like intra-ID conditional access and privileged identity management. The system is told exactly which permissions a role receives, ensuring it gets nothing more and nothing less. By doing this, you are building the authorization compiler and teaching the system how to make decisions on your behalf. During this first month, you also implement naming conventions as strict enforcement rather than mere guidelines. The system should be configured so it simply won't allow a team or a site to be created if the name violates your structure. You aren't asking users to follow standards. You are making those standards impossible to violate. The system maintains consistency because you've programmed it to view consistency as a non-optional requirement. Finally, you set up access review cycles on a quarterly or monthly basis to ensure the system constantly compares assigned access to actual needs. Users who no longer require a permission lose it immediately, and roles that have accumulated permission creep are cleaned up. You are telling the system that drift is unacceptable, which ensures that entropy never has the chance to accumulate. Phase 2 spans days 31 through 60, focusing on data classification and policy enforcement. Sensitivity labels come first, and you must apply them to every sensitive repository, including customer data, financial records, and intellectual property. You classify at the source rather than trying to fix things retroactively. When a SharePoint site is created, the default label is applied automatically, and every document stored there inherits that protection, so users always know exactly what they are handling. Next, you write your data loss prevention policies, but you do not deploy them to production yet. You test them in a non-production environment to validate that the policy matches your intent and stops violations without breaking legitimate workflows. You aren't writing policies and hoping they work. You are proving they work before the first byte of live data is affected. You also establish your purview baseline for audit logging and data lineage, telling the system to track every access, modification, and share to build the evidence trail that proves your governance is real. Phase 3 covers days 61 through 90, focusing on continuous monitoring and readiness. This is when you pilot Copilot, but you do it within a controlled scope of perhaps 100 low-risk sites. You watch what the AI accesses to validate that your labels are working and your DLP is triggering correctly. You aren't betting the entire company on a new tool. You are using the tool to stress test your governance. Automated reporting follows, covering drift detection, oversharing alerts, and license waste. The system is told to watch the environment continuously and report everything it sees. You aren't relying on a manual quarterly audit because you are monitoring daily, which allows you to catch entropy before it can grow. To wrap up the 90 days, you form an AI governance board with representatives from security, compliance, legal, and the business units. They meet monthly to review decisions, approve policy changes, and decide on future agent deployments. These people aren't just managing M365, they are architecting it to prevent the failures that plague the other 73%. After 90 days, you aren't just finished, you are ready to operate at scale because the governance is structural and the system has been taught to decide correctly. The authorization compiler, how architecture prevents entropy. This is the mental model that separates the successful 27% from everyone else. Most organizations view governance as a layer, like a coat of paint, or a piece of furniture you add to a room after the house is finished. They build the system, get it running, and then try to bolt on compliance, security, and oversight as an afterthought. That perspective is inverted. Governance is not a layer, it is the operating system itself. It isn't something you add to the system, it is the mechanism that decides what is allowed to exist within the system. The moment you treat governance as an optional add-on, the system effectively decides to be ungoverned. You should think of this as an authorization compiler. In the world of software, a compiler takes code and translates it into instructions the system can execute, but it also decides what is valid. If the code breaks a rule, the compiler rejects it at compile time rather than waiting for the program to crash later. Governance works the same way when every access decision flows through policy instead of around it. When a user tries to open a file, the authorization compiler evaluates the request before access is ever granted. It asks if the user is authorized, if their role permits the action, and if the data classification allows it. The decision is made upfront, which means the system is architecturally incapable of allowing unauthorized access. The sequence of identity, data classification, policy enforcement, and audit trail is immutable. If you skip identity, you don't know who the user is, and you cannot make a decision about someone you haven't identified. If you skip classification, your DLP policies have nothing to match, and authorization becomes nothing more than guesswork. If you skip enforcement, your rules are just comments that the system ignores, and if you skip the audit trail, you have no evidence to defend your decisions. The 27% understand that governance is the system deciding how it works from the very beginning. When you establish this foundation first, every new user and every new document inherits those rules automatically. A user cannot access something that violates policy because the authorization compiler has already determined what they are allowed to touch. The system thinks correctly because it was designed to do so. When a user tries to share a document, the compiler checks the recipient, the classification, and the DLP rules before the share happens. The system prevents the violation rather than just reporting it after the damage is done. This is exactly why the 27% never experience a Copilot stall. Their architecture prevents exposure by design. When Copilot generates a new response, that output inherits the same labels and constraints as the source data. The 73% fail because they try to retrofit an authorization compiler onto infrastructure that has already made thousands of ungoverned decisions. They have teams without naming standards and data that was overshared years ago, and now they are trying to force rules onto a permissive environment. It doesn't work because the system has already decided to be open. Architecture prevents entropy, and the only way to win is to ensure the system decides correctly because it was designed that way from day one. The remediation reality, what you're actually paying for. If you belong to that 73%, we need to talk about what a cleanup actually costs your organization. I am not just talking about the price tags on the software or the invoices from the vendors. We are looking at the true cost that accumulates across every single department while you are busy excavating your failed governance. Let's start with the direct costs of consulting. You are going to hire an external firm to come in and explain exactly where you went wrong, which means they will audit your tenant and catalog every instance of oversharing. They will track down orphaned sites and review your license waste, eventually handing you a massive report that estimates your total exposure. A basic 100-hour engagement usually starts around $50,000, but that number easily climbs to $250,000 if they are doing a deep dive. You have to pay for this comprehensive work because you never established a baseline, so you are essentially paying a premium for someone else to tell you what you should have known from day one. Tooling is the next line item on the bill. While you have the basic Microsoft 365 admin tools, they simply do not provide the visibility required for a real remediation effort. You need real-time dashboards and oversharing reports that can actually trigger drift detection or automated fixes. This usually requires third-party platforms like Manage Engine or Admin Droid to consolidate data across Entra, Exchange, and SharePoint. These subscriptions will run you anywhere from $8,000 to $20,000 a year, and that is before you factor in the time for setup, training, and integrating them with your existing stack. Then we have license optimization, which is the part of the process where you realize you have been lighting money on fire. You will find inactive accounts, over-licensed roles, and services that nobody has touched in years. If you are ruthless, you can probably recover 10 to 20% of your licensing spend, which adds up to about $144,000 a year for a 4,000-seat E3 environment. That is a significant amount of money to get back, but you cannot recover it without paying for the discovery process first. And you certainly aren't getting a refund for the thousands you wasted while those licenses sat idle. The real expense, however, lives within your labor costs. While this remediation is happening, your internal teams are effectively frozen in place. They aren't deploying new services or optimizing workflows because they are too busy fixing the past. If you dedicate a team of 6 to 9 people for the better part of a year, you are looking at nearly $1 million in internal labor alone. That is capital you aren't spending on innovation, and it represents a massive amount of work that is being deferred while you repair infrastructure that should have been architected correctly from the start. External expertise is even more punishing on the budget. Most organizations simply do not have the internal knowledge to fix a systemic governance collapse, so they have to hire architects and specialists who command $300 an hour. A 9-month engagement with these experts can easily run $500,000, and those costs only go up if they discover major security exposures during the process. These opportunity costs continue to compound as projects are deferred and new capabilities are delayed. Your teams will spend their afternoons in meetings complaining that they can't get the access they need because you are trying to implement governance retroactively. Support tickets will multiply as users ask why they were removed from groups or when their access will return. Every single one of those tickets is overhead, and every exception you grant just to stop the complaining is more architectural debt added to the pile. User friction creates a cost that is very real, even if it remains invisible on a spreadsheet. Productive employees become less effective when they are frustrated by access restrictions or confused by policies that feel like arbitrary bureaucracy. While the productivity hit might seem small for one person, when you multiply that frustration across thousands of users over 9 months, the impact is massive. That 9-month timeline is actually the best case scenario. It assumes that no complications arise and that you don't find any terrifying data exposures in the middle of the cleanup. If the organization doesn't cooperate, or if you have to pause to investigate an incident, you are looking at 18 months of work. When you do the financial math, the numbers are staggering. Between consulting, tooling, and labor, a mid-sized organization is looking at a total bill of about $1.7 million. For a larger enterprise with 4,000 users, that number jumps to $5 million. That is the price of doing it wrong. And it is exactly why the successful 27% spent $90,000 upfront to save millions in the long run. You are trying to rebuild the decision engine while the system is still running, and because the data never stops flowing, you are forced to rewrite the rules while the game is being played. The entropy principle, why this pattern is inevitable. I want to explain why this specific pattern of failure isn't just a common mistake. In architectural terms, it is a law. Entropy always increases in ungoverned systems, and that isn't just a management cliché. It is a fundamental rule of physics. You can choose to fight it or you can choose to accept it, but you cannot change the fact that order decays and complexity increases over time. Unless you are continuously applying energy to maintain order, your system will always trend toward total disorder. This is the reason 73% of organizations fall into the same trap. It isn't because the admins are incompetent or because they didn't try to do a good job. It is because they built a system that trends toward entropy by default. In the Microsoft ecosystem, the default state is creation without any constraint and sharing without any justification. Entropy isn't something that happens to you by accident. It is simply what the system does when you fail to give it specific instructions. When governance is missing, the system makes the decision to be maximally permissive. Sites default to public, groups default to everyone, and permissions are granted by default because that is the path of least resistance. The system chooses the option that requires no human decision and enables the most activity, which also happens to be the choice that generates the most entropy. You could have told the system to be restrictive from the start. You could have made sites private and required explicit permission for every single share, but that would have required architecture and hard decisions. Most organizations skip those decisions, so the system decides for them, and it always chooses to be permissive. There is a timing problem here that masks the danger. Entropy usually doesn't become visible for about 18 months, which creates a dangerous lag in your perception of risk. In the first month, everything looks clean because you haven't grown enough for the lack of governance to matter. By month 6, you might have 2,000 teams and thousands of files, but because workflows are functioning and nobody's complaining, you think the system is working. By the time you hit the 1-year mark, the orphaned sites have accumulated and the permission sprawl has become the norm. When you finally reach 18 months, the disorder is undeniable, but by then it is baked into your infrastructure. Your users now depend on that chaos to do their jobs, so undoing it causes massive disruption. The entropy becomes your new baseline. This is exactly why the governance pause always happens a few weeks into a Copilot rollout. Copilot doesn't break your system. It just surfaces the data that was already there and shows you what your permissions actually look like. It demonstrates the oversharing that nobody wanted to talk about because it wasn't obvious to the naked eye. The entropy was always present in the background, but Copilot made it impossible to ignore, forcing organizations to stop everything and fix a system that was already broken. The architectural inevitability is that a system will never create governance retroactively on its own. Instead, it just accelerates the entropy as you add more users, more data, and more integrations. Every new service you turn on increases the surface area for disorder and makes the eventual cleanup much harder to execute. The system is trending toward maximum entropy, and it will not stop until it is forced to. The successful 27% interrupted this cycle before it could start. They didn't wait for the disorder to become unbearable. They built the governance before the system had a chance to decay. They gave the system instructions to classify, track, and enforce, and the system listened because it had been given a framework. In the absence of those instructions, these systems are effectively stupid. They don't plan for the future or optimize for security. They just do what they were built to do, which is to be as permissive as possible. This pattern is inevitable because systems make predictable choices. Without a governing architecture, a system will always expand to fill all available space and default to the simplest, most dangerous options. You can only interrupt this process by telling the system how to decide and by enforcing your assumptions at scale. The organizations that fail to do this aren't just unlucky, they are simply watching the laws of physics play out in their tenant. The LinkedIn follow, architectural clarity. If this breakdown has made you feel a little uncomfortable, then we are finally starting to talk about real architecture. That discomfort is actually a data point. You are starting to recognize your own tenant inside these failure patterns, and you are seeing the messy teams environments you never actually cleaned up. You are noticing the oversharing that stayed under the radar for years, and you are realizing that the governance you thought you had simply does not exist. That recognition is the necessary first step toward fixing it, because that feeling of unease is the exact moment before a high-stakes decision is made. You have two choices here. You either accept the inevitable entropy of the system, or you decide to build actual governance. There is no middle ground to hide in because you cannot have a little bit of governance any more than you can have a partially functioning structural foundation. Governance is an architectural reality that either exists in your environment or it does not, and what happens next is entirely up to your leadership. You have the option to remediate these issues proactively right now by building the architecture your organization actually requires. That might mean paying $90,000 and waiting 90 days, but you will emerge with a system that actually works as intended. The alternative is to wait and let the entropy accumulate until you deploy Copilot and experience the inevitable project stall. When that happens, you will be forced to remediate under extreme pressure, which usually costs about $1.7 million and 9 months of digital excavation. You will eventually emerge from that process, but but your organization and your reputation will be visibly damaged. The choice is a simple binary. You can invest in correct architecture now, or you can pay for expensive archaeology later. That is exactly what I use LinkedIn for. I am not posting quick tips or surface-level tutorials or generic content designed for clicks. I provide architectural clarity through weekly breakdowns of why these massive systems fail and what the top 27% of organizations are doing differently. I focus on how to think about Microsoft 365 as a rigid architecture instead of just a collection of cool features. The real value is in understanding the weaknesses of your own tenant before the system decides to expose them to your users. You need to see the flaws before the Copilot stall happens, before the compliance audit fails, and before the entropy becomes undeniable. I do not teach people how to use Microsoft 365 because I spend my time explaining why it fails. Follow me on LinkedIn if you want to understand the architectural reality of what is actually happening inside your tenant. The uncomfortable close. What this means for you. We should be very clear about what we just walked through together. You just listened to a detailed autopsy of a governance failure, and this was not some theoretical problem or a worst-case scenario. This was an autopsy of what is happening inside 73% of organizations at this very moment. While you are listening to these words, your tenant is sprawling, and your team is likely preparing for a Copilot deployment while entropy decides your future. The people in that 73% group are not incompetent or negligent, but they simply followed the path that felt right during the first month of the project. They chose to deploy quickly to get value fast, and they told themselves they would worry about the governance side of things later. That is a perfectly rational strategy for the first 6 months of a rollout, but it becomes a catastrophic strategy once you hit the 18-month mark. Nobody seems to know that during month 1, so they choose adoption and speed because those are the paths of least resistance. The system rewards them for those choices at first because usage numbers go up and the business celebrates what looks like a massive success. The 27% who succeeded made a fundamentally different choice by prioritizing architecture over immediate adoption. They chose to slow down and build the governance framework first, which meant they didn't even start the second phase of deployment until the foundation was set. That choice felt wrong during month 1 because their usage numbers were lower and the business started questioning the entire investment. Executives wanted to know why they were paying for infrastructure that wasn't producing immediate value, and they wondered why they were waiting to deploy when they could be generating ROI today. It is a much harder sell that requires a slower timeline and a bigger upfront investment, but the payoff arrives by month 9. While the 27% were deploying their tools without a single pause, the other 73% were being forced to stop their Copilot pilots entirely. The architectural choice that felt wrong in month 1 became the only thing that mattered by month 6. The most important thing to understand about your current state is that entropy is already accumulating in your system. You do not need to deploy Copilot to know this is happening, and you do not need to hit a project stall to understand the gravity of the situation. Oversharing is happening right now, and permission sprawl is compounding alongside shadow IT and massive license waste. This entropy is not a theoretical concept, but an active force that is not going to stop growing on its own. You are standing at a decision point, but it is not the decision point you probably think it is. You are no longer choosing between a fast deployment and a slow governance model, because that decision was already made back in month 1. Now, you are choosing between remediating your environment today or remediating it later under extreme executive pressure. You are deciding if you want to fix the foundation before it becomes visible to the board, or if you want to fix it after Copilot exposes the rot to everyone. This is the real decision that determines how much money you are going to lose. If you choose to remediate now, you are making a disciplined investment in architectural rigor and policy enforcement. You spend 90 days focusing on sensitivity labels and access reviews, and you pay the $90,000 required to get it right. Because you did that work, Copilot deploys without a pause, your licensing stays optimized, and your compliance audits pass without issue. The entropy that was going to destroy your project is prevented before it ever has a chance to take root. If you choose to wait, you are simply deferring a much larger cost until month 6 arrives and the Copilot rollout stalls. Once the oversharing becomes undeniable, you will be forced to pause and investigate the full scope of the problem. 9 months later, you will have spent $1.7 million to end up with the exact same governance architecture you could have built today. The difference is that you will also have massive business disruption, an expensive incident response, and regulatory exposure that you cannot undo. You will have frustrated your users and lost months of opportunity just to reach the same end state at 4 times the original cost. There is no magic workaround or secret solution that allows you to have a fast deployment without a governance foundation. You will discover this truth every single time you try to bypass the rules of architecture. You will deploy, you will hit the wall of entropy, and you will be forced to pause and remediate before you can move forward again. The system is effectively predicting your future, and in my experience, the system is rarely wrong. The uncomfortable part of this discussion is not the information itself, but the recognition of your own reality. You are seeing your own tenant in these statistics, and you are finally understanding why the Copilot pause was always inevitable. Given your current architecture and the lack of governance, that pause is already waiting for you. The only real question is whether you are going to meet that moment proactively or reactively. You have to decide if you are going to interrupt this pattern or simply inherit the failure. You can choose to build architecture now, or you can wait to excavate it later, but what you do in the next 30 days will determine your next 9 months. I do not teach Microsoft 365 because my job is to explain why it inevitably fails. The 73% will eventually remediate their environments, but they will do it under extreme pressure and at a massive cost after their data is already exposed. This happens because the system decided for them. The 27% succeeded because they understood that governance is not an optional add-on, but rather the foundation of the entire architecture, so they built it first. The system always decides. If you fail to tell the engine how to make those choices, it defaults to entropy. Everything that followed for that 73% was just the system collapsing under its own weight, which is not a failure but a law of architectural inevitability. Follow me on LinkedIn if you want to understand what is actually happening inside your tenant.